I start with what motivates artists to become artists, because that's really the central question. What motivates a young person to seek a life in a creative discipline? And how does that person see herself or himself within the larger context of his or her immediate environment, country, culture? All of these things, I think, need some very, very careful attention. And I'm going to be circling back to this attitude at the beginning, at the end of the lecture, so that the circle will really complete itself. But the fact of the matter is that no great artwork can be understood without having the context of its culture and its customs. And one of the most extraordinary cases of such a phenomenon is the idea that a composer could for a moment become a sociologist rather than someone who is just writing music to entertain or to render joy or sorrow or terror, which of course is a strong motivating factor. But the fact is that, as we can see so well when we look at paintings, that art is layered with semiotics, with symbols, with things which tell us things about those people and other people. They have to do with the way people talk, the way they gesticulate, the kinds of clothing they wear, the class of society in which they function and their relationship with that and other layers of society. And the piece of sociology I have in mind, just to get us started, is of course the ballroom scene in Act 1 of Don Giovanni. What possibly could have motivated Mozart to spend some valuable time in his opera depicting the three basic classes of society: the aristocrats dancing the minuet, the bourgeoisie dancing the country dance, and the peasants dancing the deutsche. And what better way to understand the volatility of the sociality, the social relationship here, than to see that Don Giovanni, who's an aristocrat, seduces Zerlina, who's a peasant, insofar as he moves down one cultural level to the middle and pulls her up one cultural level to the middle, and they meet there and they dance the counter dance. And Mozart, of course, writes three of these dances, and they all sound simultaneously: in 3/4 time, in 2/4 time, and in 3/8 time. Perhaps he thought that someday people would be interested in understanding the social proportions of his time. And I could imagine that. But I can imagine much more that it reflects his fascination with the world in which he lives, and an extraordinary interest in holding a mirror up to that society, confident in the fact that that mirror would reflect not only the people of that particular time and place, but would have something eternal about it that would tell us, that would warn us about certain essential information regarding who we are. And I think the only reason that art is both of its time and transcends time is that. How else can I explain the fact that one day when I was playing with the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra in Minnesota, I had a day off, so I went to the Minneapolis Museum of Art. And I walked into the museum, and after visiting about 3 rooms, I came into a room and, without focusing on it, realized that there was something in the corner of the room that was pulling me over there. And I couldn't really focus on it, but I got a little bit closer, and it turned out that it was a painting by Rembrandt. It was a painting in which, it's a famous subject, in which Lucretia, who has been falsely accused of adultery, takes her own life to avoid disgrace to her husband. And the painting shows her with a tear welling up in one eye, with a knife which has a drop of blood on it, and with a white muslin blouse which is already pink and spreading in its color. And I stared at this painting, and I started to weep. The expression on her face was paralyzing, was harrowing. And I thought, I'm making a fool of myself here in this museum, falling apart. I have to get out of this room. So I turned and started to walk out of the room and found I couldn't. I came back and I wept all over again. It took me 3 attempts to get out of that room. And I started to think about this. I said, wait a minute. This is a painting that was made 275 years ago about something that happened 2,000 years ago. What's wrong with me? I don't think there's anything wrong with me in that respect. There may be other things wrong with me, but not that. I mean, what it shows is the hypnotic effect that art has on us. And I think all of us in this room know this. That's why we're all here. So, we assume that great artists are fascinated by the world that surrounds them and have an extraordinary desire to interact with it. Most artists throughout history have made themselves chroniclers of one sort or another, whether poets or novelists or painters or sculptors or musicians or dancers. They have all looked at society, and most of them, like Mozart with his ballroom scene, are depicting a world that they know to tell their fellow human beings things about themselves that they as artists are probably a lot more skilled at revealing than those people would find out by themselves. And if indeed they are chroniclers, and not only of the superficialities of human existence, but rather more chroniclers of the interior, of the private lives of people, which is why it was always dangerous to have Rembrandt paint your portrait rather than Frans Hals, by the way. Because Frans Hals would, in a few virtuoso strokes, represent you the way a fashion photographer would, just the way you want to be, immensely successful, self-confident, and completely inscrutable. With Rembrandt, there were no secrets. You look at a person there, everything you can imagine in the privacy and the biography of that person is implicit. And great artists do that. So they are extraordinary at delving into the interior lives, the intimacies of their fellow human beings. And so they are mostly reactive within their creativity. And that sets the scene for the subject of my talk, because there is, in every era, here and there, an artist whose inner life becomes more obsessive than the traditional artistic responsibility of looking outward and rendering people as they observe them. But if you think about it, because in fact art always depended on patronage, for the most part you would paint what people wanted you to paint, because you served the court, you served the church. You know, if you were going to be Tiepolo or Tintoretto, you know what you had to do, because that's what they wanted. That was a given. But on the other hand, how do you explain Albrecht Dürer's painting of a field hare, a bunny? You know, Albrecht Dürer painted a bunny. It's an amazing bunny, by the way. If you've ever seen it, you know what I mean. You feel like you could stroke it. The fur is so uncanny. It's just crazy. But here's the thing. Why on earth would a great genius like Dürer take all of that time and effort and virtuosity and expertise to paint a bunny? Why did Watteau paint a painting of, I think it's Pierrot, it's one of the Commedia dell'arte pictures, catching a fly? The fly is on his hand, and he's coming just at it like this. And it's delectable, of course. But I don't really think the Duc de je ne sais quoi or the Baron de je ne sais qui really said to Watteau, please paint a picture of somebody catching a fly. I'd like to put it in my living room. You know? So you understand that there are certain extracurricular motivations for things. Maybe one could say that Dürer painted the rabbit because he thought it would be an incredible challenge, and he wanted to show that he could do it. You know? I mean, after all, why did Mozart write the finale of the Jupiter Symphony? Because he really wanted to show people that he could do it. You know, we don't have the sketch where he figured out those 5 tunes that were going to go together, and we can't believe he wrote the whole finale and he got to the second double bar and he said, okay, it's now time to fit. Oh gosh, they don't work at all. Oh Jesus, I got to start all over again, write the whole goddamn movement. No, obviously he started with a sketch in which all of those things put together, and then he deconstructed them and stuck them in the right places, and he got himself a masterpiece. So, the normal life of an artist is acting and reaching outward. But certain people become fascinated with their inner life and feel that the volatility, the unpredictability, the disorder, the emotional turmoil inside them is something about which they must communicate with the outer world. There are not so many people like this. Mere exotism, I mean, the fact that Gesualdo wrote these astounding chromatic pieces is fascinating in and of itself. What it really tells about himself, the arch criminal, or his relationship to society, is to some degree inscrutable. But the idea that what you prefer to do more than paint a picture of this person or depict a scene or a narrative there is to read out of your diary, to reveal as mercilessly as Rembrandt would paint somebody the truths about you, your nightmares, your dreams. That is not a normative or majority kind of thing in history until Mr. Beethoven comes along. He's not the first, nor is Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach the first. But of those people that we know the best in the tumult of history, Philipp Emanuel Bach really stands out because, of course, he got a first-rate education from his father, and fortunately, he chronicled it in his treatise, which everybody should read, as they should read Quantz's flute treatise, as they should read Türk's piano treatise, or for that matter, of course, Leopold Mozart's violin treatise. You know, we had an interesting talk this afternoon about some of these issues. And so I just remind you that we talked about instructive editions and treatises. So I just point out in passing, speaking of Mr. Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, that one of the things you have to think about when you read a treatise is the particular bee in the bonnet of the person who's writing it. In the case of Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, the motivation is pure. Within years of his father's death, he sees a legacy that he wishes to preserve. It is selfless. If you read Esteban de Arteaga's treatise on voice, that man is really angry at a lot of people who sing the way he really hates, which is very interesting. But, for instance, when you have all of these voice treatise writers who are complaining about all of this embellishment that's going on, you get the one group of musicologists that say, see, that shows you shouldn't do it. And the other group says, see, that shows you that they did. You don't complain about something that isn't happening. You see? So Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach is a man with an extraordinary education who, preserves a lineage, who performs the St. Matthew Passion 5 times, stealing liberally from his fathers and from Homilius and from other people, and supplying a little bit of his own. But then he writes these keyboard pieces, and in particular, these fantasies. And these fantasies are pretty hard in all of music history to match for their craziness. And for that reason alone, we should all play them. Because the tension of disorder within the spirit is so vivid that it tells us something that we need to understand about the act of performance, which we're talking about in this conference. And we're not talking here about contrariness, because we could talk about Frescobaldi's toccatas, masterpieces of willful rhetoric, absolutely not to be surpassed. But what's going on in C.P.E. Bach is something else. And in it, you see a deliberate depiction of a knockdown, drag-out fight between order and logic on the one hand, and irrationality, volatility, terror on the other. And that combination was enormously influential on the succeeding generations. Let's not forget that when people talked about Bach in the second half of the 18th century, it was C.P.E. they were talking about, not J.S. Mozart said, "Wir sind die Kinder," no, ist der Vater, wir sind die Buben. He said, he's the father, we're the kids. And Beethoven is said to have said, "We no longer do as he does, but without him we could do nothing." Keeping in mind that for C.P.E. Bach, the soul of his expressive muse was the clavichord. And Beethoven's declining hearing notwithstanding, it was also his favorite keyboard instrument. Yes, the clavichord. Perfect travel instrument. Stick it under your arm and go off into the coach and travel. So C.P.E. Bach is living this extraordinary Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde double life in these fantasies. And what I'm going to do now is to show you the genealogy of C.P.E. Bach's rhetoric and expression by simply tracing the line that goes from C.P.E. Bach to Mozart to Beethoven. Then we arrive at Beethoven. Once we arrive at Beethoven, from that point of view, that particular, peculiar point of view, we can then start talking about Beethoven's individual journey, which begins, like almost everyone else's, in apprenticeship, in copying, in deriving, in looking at other music and making it his own, and above all, in being a kind of a chronicler of society, as he is in his first piano sonatas, for instance, in Bonn, or the next ones, Opus 2, in Vienna. But then, after a while, something starts to happen, and that's the subject of the lecture. Now it's time for some music. I chose not any old C.P.E. Bach fantasy. They're all astonishing. But I chose, for obvious reasons, the one in F-sharp minor, which bears the title C.P.E. Bach's Empfindungen. I mean, imagine that. He writes a piece that says, "These are my feelings, folks," bearing all. And I also chose it for another reason, because it starts and ends in F-sharp minor. And he lived at a time, as Beethoven did when, and we talked about this with the Webern Symphony, when equal temperament was not the law of the land. There did not exist equal. Don't let anyone tell you that the Bach well-tempered clavier proselytizes for equal temperament. It's rubbish. If, in fact, Bach was already tuning in equal temperament, why was Kirnberger still experimenting with compromised temperaments after Bach died? No, that just won't work. So you could tell when Haydn or Beethoven, Beethoven starts. And later on, you listen carefully, those chords don't sound the same because they're not. And this is as good a time as any to thank from my heart Leonardo Miucci for supplying this lovely Wilhelm Leschen piano, not a copy, but an original from 1821, made by a man who serviced Beethoven's own pianos and had a lively relationship with Beethoven. So this is a nice little link to the past. And I asked him to tune it in Valotti, so that you would understand that hearing this, and this, and this, and this, it's not out of tune, folks. It's what it is. All right, Stefan, it's time for you to come up here and help me, and we're going to have some music. Now, this is a clavichord piece, not a piano piece. So I'm not going to be using pedal. Okay. That was the father. Let's hear from the kid. Now, something about this that you need to know. This is a very famous fantasy by Mozart in D minor, and it bears the K number of 397. And what you need to know is the K number is completely off chronologically. This is not a piece that he wrote sometime around 1782. It's a piece that he wrote very late, probably 1788 to 1789, which makes it even more interesting for us because it shows that the heritage of C.P.E. Bach accompanies him all the way through his life. And by the way, it might even be the case that when C.P.E. Bach died in 1788, that maybe this fantasy is Mozart's way of tipping his hat. He did that. When Johann Christian Bach died, he wrote his A major concerto K414. When Carl Friedrich Abel died, he quoted an Abel violin sonata in his A major violin sonata for piano and violin K526. So it's not impossible. The other thing you need to know about this fantasy is that the version that you usually hear with a nice uproarious D major conclusion at the end quite loudly is not by Mozart. It's probably by August Eberhard Müller, who was then the cantor of St. Thomas's and J.S. Bach's successor. And it was first published under the title Fantaisie d'introduction, which is exactly what it is. It's a fantasy that takes you to a dominant seventh in D major, after which presumably you might play a sonata. Which sonata? Well, it could be a Mozart sonata, it could be 284 or 311 or 576. But it could also be Beethoven Opus 10 number 3 or Opus 28. I'll give you a sample, but I'm obviously not going to play the whole Beethoven sonata. We have other fish to fry tonight. A little water won't hurt. The relationship between the rhetoric here and that of C.P.E. Bach ought to be rather unmistakable. So you pianists in the audience, some of you should do that, you see? Because playing that silly little ending is just not what the doctor ordered. Now, my venerated colleague, Mitsuko Uchida, goes back to D minor and plays the opening material again, which is a very, very beautiful thing to do. But I don't know a piece by Mozart that goes from D minor to D major and then goes back. You know, think of the D minor concerto. But it's a great idea. And anyway, it's a better idea than the one that we all use. So that's that. Now, the Beethoven Fantasy Opus 77 occupies a singular place in his oeuvre. We have several fantasies of Mozart, lots of them from C.P.E. Bach, and a large number of them from J.S., among others. This is a good point to remind you what the word fantasy meant then. You know, fantasy, of course, can mean something like a whim. You know, just an idea of something you just spontaneously decide to do. But in the 18th century, the word improvise did not exist. They did not use the word improvisation, Improvisation, they used the word fantasieren. Herr Mozart wird auf einem ganzen Fortepiano-Pedal fantasieren. Handbill for a concert in 1785. So the idea of a fantasy is that it's a kind of a protocol of an actual improvisation. And it's not unreasonable to think that in writing this fantasy down, Beethoven might have just been committing to paper in the way that Chopin did with his ballades, which were first improvised, as I understand it, and then later committed to paper and perfected. But in any case, Beethoven, at his notorious Akademie at the 22nd of December, 1808, in the Theater an der Wien, you know, where the public, the general public, heard for the first time the Fifth Symphony, the Sixth Symphony, the Fourth Piano Concerto, 3 movements from the C major Mass, the choral fantasy, and one old piece, A Perfido, the concert aria, and Beethoven improvised. So it may very well be that later he decided that he would try to commit to paper something approaching what he did at that time. Now, there is an interesting sociology to this fantasy, too, because the first half of it is C.P.E. Bach pure. It's bolts of lightning and sorrow and then more excitement, and it goes back and forth. And then it settles into one of the favorite objects for improvisation during that time of Mozart and Beethoven, which was to improvise variations, mostly based on the hit aria from the hit opera of the time. So in this case, Beethoven starts this fantasy in G minor, and he gets to B minor and then presents us with a series of variations in B major, knowing full well that the tuning between G minor and B major was going to be quite outlandish. He was not one who worried about these sorts of things. I think he delighted in them. So I shall try to delight in this piece, which is no pushover, I'll tell you. So I think we can all agree that C.P.E. Bach cast quite a long shadow. I think it's quite clear that neither that Mozart piece nor that Beethoven piece would have taken shape in anything approaching the form that it did without having an antecedent like that. And it is precisely this kind of modulation back and forth between order and disorder, which is so crucial to that aesthetic. Now, Beethoven is not alone in having his work divided into 3 periods. I think almost every artist's life is divided into 3 periods. I do, and I'll try to explain that. You spend your youth as an apprentice. And when you pass beyond the level of apprenticeship, you function very, very well, and you create a fine body of work in an inherited language. But there is something restless inside you that impels you to seek a bit further. And you start to become more personal in some ways. But above all, you discover that there's an extraordinary, subtle balance between what it is you have to say and how you know how to say it. That's the middle period. With Mozart, it starts in the K400s. 1784, I would say. You know, we know when it starts with Beethoven because everybody always thinks about Beethoven in that way. But what happens to Beethoven also happens to Mozart, and it happens to Bach, and it happens to Schubert, it happens to all of them to some degree, which is this is what it is. As you write your corpus of artwork, as you paint your paintings, write your sonnets, make your sonatas, you're continually thinking. And what you're doing is you're taking the barrel of a camera lens and you're bringing it into focus. When you get into your middle period, it is in focus. That's the ideal thing. But human beings are very, very strange. And artists, of course, are stranger than anybody because they're so much more aware of these kinds of volatile things. What they do is they keep on rotating the lens. They don't stop just because it gets to that ideal moment. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is when their music starts to become peculiar. And in no case in music history is it clearer than with Beethoven. Because we have the late sonatas and we have the late quartets and so on. But don't fool yourself. If you listen to the Bach of the late 1740s, you'll hear it too. If you listen to late Haydn, you will hear it everywhere. And with Mozart, once you get into the late 490s and into the 500s, it's there to be seen. The 2 viola quintets, and especially the later 2. Very, very strange things going on there. So let's not single Beethoven out in that respect. But what does start to happen is that Beethoven looks inward. Who knows if it would have happened at the same pace, or indeed at all, had he not been subjected to the ultimate calamity for a musician of the loss of his hearing. That in 1802 precipitates a spiritual and artistic crisis. And naturally, he will look inward. But an artist of his greatness would have done that sooner or later anyway. It's just a matter, perhaps, of the moment. But he starts to look inside himself and realizes, especially being the idealist that he is, as opposed to Haydn and Mozart, who were absolute realists. They painted the world the way it was. You know, Mozart is shocking in that respect, in that, like almost no other artist, he doesn't make judgments about his characters. You think about it. Don Giovanni raises the champagne glass, you're all going to go to the party. You know he's a monster, but you like him. That's because he doesn't do anything to tell you not to. But how many people belong to the Albrecht fan club? Yeah? How many people hear the entry of the Grand Inquisitor and Don Carlo and says, gee, that's a guy I'd like to have a beer with? You know? The composers of operas tell you whom you're supposed to like and whom you're not supposed to, and Mozart tells you absolutely nothing, so that if you're the actress or the actor that's on the stage, there's nothing that prevents you from getting the empathy of the audience. But again, there's something he doesn't judge, but at the same time, he doesn't show his hand, except once in a while when some calamity happens. How many Mozart pieces, how many Bach pieces are connected with deaths in the family or friends? Not very many. You know? They say the A minor sonata was the death of his mother, which is certainly the right time, and it's on Paris paper, and A minor for Mozart is the key of death. The next time he loses somebody dear to him is Count Hatzfeld, and he writes the A minor rondo, K511. So there can be connections like this, but most of the time there aren't. But Beethoven is an idealist. We know that. He stands for liberty and dignity. He stands for the best for his fellow human beings, and he's willing to fight for it. He's going to write an opera that's not going to win any friends in the court. That's not something you want to write about. And he does it because he has immense courage. His personal will is overwhelming. He was not a person who could just sit down and write a string quartet just like that, like Schubert. We have these extraordinary sketchbooks which show the torment, the suffering, the unbelievable stages he had to go through. You look at, as I did, Landsberg 6, which is the sketchbook with the Eroica Symphony, and you look at him struggling to write a scherzo, and you think, this guy's hopeless. You know, he should open up a dry goods store, or, you know, maybe become a blacksmith or something, you know? This is so clumsy. It's not, and you have to pinch yourself and say, you know what happened to this? I guess he was okay after all. But I mean, when you imagine the anguish he went through, the mental anguish he went through, you know, he had an extraordinary gift, but it was not made easy. You know, there was a lot of sandpaper along the way that was really cutting gashes in his spirit. And he put up with that. And it turned him inward more and more. And this dichotomy between a man who wanted so much decency and rectitude and all of these things, who would dedicate that very symphony to Bonaparte and then cross it out when Bonaparte made himself emperor. And then there's a passage, because of course the three pieces in E-flat major are all about that. There's the piece in E-flat major called the Eroica, then there's the second piece, which is the Das Lebewohl, when his patron Archduke Rudolf leaves because Napoleon is besieging the town, and it's in E-flat major, and that's the reason. And then, in the fulmination of the orchestral tutti, in the last movement of the Emperor Concerto, in the margin it says, Österreich löhne Napoleon. I mean, that's really something, you know? Austria pays Napoleon back. It's like you're reading the newspaper. You know, I mean, it's a piece of current events. It's an extraordinary visceral connection with all of these things. And all of this is causing Beethoven to turn inward. And he turns inward and he writes music which is not like music that anybody else is writing. We can tell that it has its roots in the Viennese classical style, but it is not like that. It's certainly not like Hummel, who, by the way, was much more popular than Beethoven was during their lifetimes. Much more. Had an enormous influence on composers like Mendelssohn. But Beethoven turned inward and decided that the best thing he could do was to read from his diary, to tell us what he had dreamt of the previous night, to tell us what his lofty aims are for the future, and to say, yes, I could make a picture of you or you or you the way everybody else is, but actually I know myself better. And I can support myself in a way because I've got these wonderful stipends from Lobkowitz and from Archduke Rudolf and from Lichnowsky, and I don't have to worry about where my money's coming from, so I can really manage to be a complete idealist. So, if that's the case, he says, what do I want? And search becomes a metaphor in Beethoven. Looking for something, for a secret, for an answer to a question that he has posed. I'm not making any of this stuff up. So there, ladies and gentlemen, is the question. That's the question. And all the piano can do to respond is to say, is that really what you're asking? I'm asking this question, all right. And you know what, folks? I'm going to ask it again. We can only hope that's not the answer. It's a shattering answer, and it's one that shows how much the answer matters. That is, it is capable of eliciting endless sorrow and anguish from him at the mere thought that the answer could be less than the affirmation that he so desperately seeks. And we have to wait until the end of the piece, you know. We have to wait until the end of that movement before we get the answer. You will recall. That now is the time for the answer because the time has run out. And what is the answer? Duh! What? That's the answer? But it's so obvious! And then I imagine Beethoven saying, yes, it is completely obvious, but you didn't guess it, did you? You see, and that becomes an extraordinary metaphor. In piece after piece after piece, this idealist who will not give up on dignity and on rectitude, and he keeps on searching, and he keeps on asking these questions, and the answer is always astoundingly obvious, and we can't figure it out. Here's another example. Let's stay with the cello sonatas. They're very good for this. Although there are plenty of other pieces that will show this. You know, it's so warm and so vulnerable and so touching. And it stretches out its arms at us, and it's asking a question again. You know, you have this little scale, and you have this common chord, this triad, and you have this little seventh chord. What's the answer? You see, and he keeps on asking the question. And finally, and you think there's got to be a catch. It's too nice too soon. If you think a little bit, you'll be not entirely surprised because in Beethoven there are no coincidences ever. And so you get this frightening A minor first movement in a sonata that's supposed to be in C major, and you come to the end of it, and there's wreckage wide and far, like those horrific pictures we're seeing right now of the Caribbean. It's absolutely chaos and disorder. And then Beethoven does something which is new. And it meant so much to him that he immediately copied it in Opus 101, which despite the opus numbers, 102, 101, the cello sonatas were written first. And after this, we get this. bet there are a lot of people who hear that and don't recognize where this comes from. It's remembrance. Remembering when the world was easy and sunshine was there and life was beautiful and the servant girl that you liked so much brought you your coffee. She couldn't stand your untidy habits, so she left. But in those days, things were wonderful. And you know, you have this. Very strange. Everything in shadows, everything mystical and unfathomable. And there it is, ladies and gentlemen, the existential question. What is to become of us? And then something unimaginably tender happens. And not, no. And we ache all over because it's been such a long night. And such a long night that probably when the cello plays, we don't notice that this is from there and the other is from here. It's all part of that strange dream. And so what happens? Like the prisoners crawling out of the dungeon in Fidelio, having seen daylight for the first time, the cello climbs from the depths up, and the curtain comes open, and suddenly we remember as it was, before all of the distress, all of the anguish, when life was pure and simple. And we think, we're going to get the answer now. And we will. That's the answer. The answer to is, I don't know about you, but I feel a little stupid. Did none of us see that coming? You see, this is not a kind of music that a Mozart could write. It's not a movement that Schubert could write either. Because you live in an extraordinary interiorized world in which just the whole sense of recollection and the present and the future is all very liquid and very foggy and subject to constant shivers of pain or sudden flooding delight that we could not have passioned before. It's a music, well, to quote my teacher, Nadia Boulanger, she was lying pretty close to the end. In September 1979, she was 92 years old. Her birthday is in a couple of days, 140th birthday. And Leonard Bernstein visited her. And he realized that she was barely conscious, and so he started to take his leave, and she said, no, stay. And he thought, well, he needed to talk with her. What would he talk about? Then he thought he had it. Mademoiselle, do you hear music? Ah, yes, always. What music do you hear? He wondered. Monteverdi, Bach, Beethoven, Stravinsky. A music which has neither beginning nor end. You know? And Beethoven starts to experiment with pieces. It's very difficult to avoid ending pieces, but it's very interesting trying to write pieces which don't have a beginning. He was no amateur at it, having started rather well in Opus 31, number 3. Which, by the way, Mr. Schumann noticed. Or, starting on the second degree is not an obvious thing to do, but it's a wonderful way to launch the piece full throttle into the future. And so Beethoven had done that before, but he had never done anything quite like. You know, when I teach this piece, I say to the pupil, you know, you're walking along the city walls, and in the distance you see the Palais Schwarzenberg. And you see that all the chandeliers are lit up. You think, oh, there's something going on in there. Let's see what's going on there, you know. And you have to go up to the first floor where the ballroom is, you know. And you open up the door. And Beethoven is sitting at the keyboard, and the aristocrats are listening to him. And at the very, very moment that you just happen to open the door, you hear. Was that the beginning of the piece, or did you just come in 30 seconds too late? I mean, what would he have written before that? Well, it's not so bad, is it? It doesn't matter what we would invent because it doesn't belong, but what does belong is this extraordinary sense of a music which suddenly floats into our hearts. And it's not like anything that we've ever heard before. And it doesn't even have to be as speculative as that, because it can just as easily be something like this. And if he's not searching for something there, then what is he doing? He starts with the simplest kind of tune, and by the way, keep your eye on that tune because it's going to become the fugue subject later on. If you never noticed that before, start to think about Beethoven this way. He rewards careful thought. He really does. But the sense of the unfolding of that, which leads to another step of another kind of introduction, and then to a little playful thing, and then to ecstasy. And then he writes the same kind of piece in 110 that he had already written in 101, which he had already written in Opus 102, number 1, which is the night intermezzo. You know, when you finish Opus 101, and suddenly what do we hear? The gates of heaven swing open. This needy soul is on his knees, and suddenly he asks that question, and up go the curtains, and God says, "Fear not." Beethoven says, "All right, I'll start again." You know, he says, I'll take the courage. And it doesn't go well. Agony. And then suddenly the clouds shift and he finds himself in this strange drug-like haze and comes up and comes down. And suddenly there's that music that we heard at the beginning of the piece, just the way it was in the cello sonata. And to remember is to be redeemed. This isn't music anymore, ladies and gentlemen. This is philosophy. This is the testament of a man who a few short years later was the victim of 3 cheerful diseases, each one of them betting that they would kill him first, living in unspeakable physical pain and writing those quartets. He's a martyr, an absolute martyr. He gave us spiritually what no one else has given us. Those quartets will remain radical, revolutionary, and in some ways imponderable forever. They're beyond anything except maybe some of those late Bach pieces, you know, which, of course, influenced him so much. I take a step back here. History moves ever faster. Art was based for a very long time on the notion of a lingua franca, a language that everybody could understand. When Mozart said, "What are you doing, Haydn? You're going to London. You don't speak the language." He said, "My language is spoken everywhere." And in fact, from Lisbon to St. Petersburg, in the 1780s, people spoke that language. Haydn was a little different from Mozart, but they went arm in arm to the rehearsals of Così fan tutte. They understood one another perfectly well. You know, go back a few ages. The international school, you know, led by mostly the Flemings, lasted about 250 years. The Baroque era lasted about 150. The classical period lasted maybe 75 to 80. The Romantic era lasted about 60. Now, while that was all going on, the notion of a lingua franca spoken by everybody started to deteriorate. A greater emphasis on individualism began to grip the arts. And this is where Beethoven comes in. Because my teacher, she quoted her dear friend, the philosopher and poet Paul Valéry, very often. And one of the things that Valéry said that she quoted was, "In the past, one imitated mastery. Now one seeks singularity." To which Nadia Boulanger pointed out, it's actually very cruel what he is saying, because one is not singular by choice. That's something a lot of people need to hear and know. Do you think Beethoven simply decided that he was going to write music that was different from everyone else's because he wanted to be different from anyone else? Do you really think he had a choice? Did Chopin have a choice? Did Schumann have a choice? No, but you couldn't talk about Chopin and Schumann and Mendelssohn and all those people without Beethoven having blazed that trail. He showed that it was possible to develop an identity that was so extraordinary that it would forever change the agenda from depictive to confessional. And by his making himself ever more inward, he made it possible for us to do the same. Because it's up to us to take his lessons and make them ours. I'm done.